So I want to thank everybody for attending the Technology and Policy Responses to Climate Disruption Symposium. I'm Bogucz. I'm the Crandall Melvin Professor of Law and Director of the Technology Commercialization Program here at Syracuse University College of Law. And I'm really delighted, especially for out-of-town speakers, to make the trip, and for our Syracuse colleagues to make the journey over the hill and down the hill to the law school. I think this will be a good conversation. I want this to sort of be part of a long-term project. I'm not an environmental law scholar. I've taken environmental law. I've worked a little bit with David Dreesen on some projects. But I'm really interested in this question of technology transfer, as well as thinking about ways in which technology can be used for social and economic development. And climate disruption policy, climate change policy, the whole question about environmental justice, I think is a really great and fruitful avenue for thinking about where I'm focused on. But this is not just something about me. I'm sort of lucky in a position that I've got colleagues across the world, and they're very generous to take their time to come and have a dialogue about these issues. So people will come in and out. The proceedings are being recorded, and they'll be put on the Syracuse Technology Commercialization Law webpage. I think we also have a YouTube channel. So look forward to maybe having some follow-up from that in terms of circulation. But I really hope to think about the policy issues and possible cross-disciplinary collaborations that can come up on this issue. So I won't monopolize the conversation now. I might later with questions and so forth, but I look forward to a very fruitful dialogue. We'll go seriatim from the program that was distributed earlier. And so our first speaker is Eric Schiff, who is in the Department of Physics at Syracuse University College of Arts and Sciences. So I'll just pass the baton to you.
Thanks very much.
Sure.
All right. This is going to be an informal presentation. I think some of us didn't actually know we were making presentations. So this is actually a photograph from the slide that I showed when I gave my job talk 4 years ago to go to a Department of Energy agency called ARPA-E. This is the very one that was zeroed out in the original thin budget from the current administration. And I'm happy to say that it's actually, in the recent budget allocation, been increased about 15% over its baseline, so the Congress didn't agree with the president on this. Anyway, ARPA-E is an agency that tries to find relatively immature technologies where there's a chance of commercialization if successful funding is given them. So it's divided into a bunch of programs. About 10 per year are initiated. They're about 30 million each with about 10 projects per. So it's actually pretty good money, especially for universities. We sometimes say the university people have no idea how to spend that much money, although one of the projects done at the Center of Excellence, I'm sure Professor Khalifa knew how to spend the money. But in any case, so that's just a brief introduction to ARPA-E. But what was concerning me, and one of the reasons that I chose to go there for 4 years, I'm now back full-time at Syracuse University, was dealing with things like carbon emissions and climate change and what we could feasibly do about it. So I'm not going to tell you my actual job talk, but this is a slide that was based on it. The inspiration for it was the following, that there's one thing where we're not likely to be able to get rid of carbon emissions, which is jet travel. And so if you want jet travel, which is a significant fraction already in the United States, about 10% of all transportation-related carbon emissions are due to jet travel. It's rising steeply, whereas you can expect with the onset of electric vehicles and autonomous vehicles that the need for carbon emissions from other sources of transportation could feasibly decline. Jet travel we don't have a good solution for. Let me see, how do I change slides? Well, no, I can talk for 20 minutes on this one, but there we are, the clicker. Okay. Anyway, so to some extent inspired by that, towards the end of my time at ARPA-E, I wanted to return to it. The actual project that I fostered when I was at ARPA-E was in the area of building energy efficiency, closely related to the Center of Excellence, although not literally linked, that isn't actually allowed. But I wanted to return towards the end of my time there more fundamentally to the issue of carbon emissions and something that had to some extent inspired my going to it. So let's just go back to pricing carbon emissions. Do I have an economist who's going to keep me honest? Hopefully not. Darn. Oh well, too bad for me. But anyway, let's just plow on. So at least in our present U.S. political climate, one of the strategies towards reducing emissions is basically to tax them or to do carbon credits of various kinds. And that is a procedure favored by many economists because it's fairly efficient in certain senses. So you tax it, but the purpose is to discourage wasteful behavior, what I would call wasteful behavior, not the behavior we desired. But anyway, it's never really caught on in the United States. It did a little better in Europe. And instead, what I was interested in was to actually look at it as a disposal fee. What would it cost if we retrieved the carbon dioxide we emit, for example, from a jet airplane? So the answer to that, roughly one of the answers to that, and the one I'll talk about just a little bit right now, is to simply do what's called direct air capture and suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, which is an extremely interesting technical leap. And then you would charge the market price for the recovery. Now in the early stages, actually, you can make money back because there is a market for carbon dioxide, which I'll briefly allude to in the next slide. So the early stages, you can make some of the recovery back. In later stages, you would expect the price for carbon retrieval from direct air capture to decline as it scales up, as technologies improve. That's essentially a universal behavior for these sorts of things. On the other hand, these markets will be saturated at a certain point. We emit far more carbon dioxide than is needed for industrial applications. So you'd have a couple of augmentations. So anyway, we don't know how it would work out in the long run, really. There's been too little done, but it's worth pondering whether that would be the right approach to obtaining a fair price for carbon emissions. So anyway, this is a rather complex slide, and it's the only one I'll show you. It was sort of my swan song at RPE, was to develop some of these ideas. So direct air capture's been around, it's a dream. Let's just fix the problem of carbon dioxide by sucking it right back out of the atmosphere. And there have been learned societies, the American Physical Society, the National Academy of Sciences have looked in it, and they came out about 10 years ago with very discouraging reports. And there are some pioneering scientists such as Klaus Lochner, who have been essentially violently resisting those conclusions. So let me start by telling you essentially the basis for some of the negative reports. There's something called the Sherwood plot. So those two top lines on the left, one says metals mining and the other gases scrubbing. Those show the empirical experience, for example, if you clean pollutants out of smokestacks, or you need a small amount of gold out of a huge amount of ore. And what you find is there's a certain price for the product that you want, dollars per ton, that's the left. This is a logarithmic plot. So it's $10,000 per ton at the top, which sounds like probably a good price for gold if you could get it, dropping all the way to $10 a ton. Anyway, so for metals and mining, and then it turns out for scrubbing of gases and things like pollution control, the two curves are fairly similar. The higher the concentration in the ore if it's metals, or in the gas stream if it's scrubbing, the higher the concentration of the thing you're pulling out, the cheaper it is to pull it out. And so that you see the price drops according to the concentration. Okay, of course, if the concentration was 100%, I guess the price would be 0 or something like that, just the price of transferring it. But if it was 10%, it's a lot more efficient to withdraw it than it is if it's 0.001% or 0.0001%. So anyway, I'm sure you get the idea. Now, the next question is for direct air capture. So where are the actual opportunities? If direct air capture of carbon dioxide were $1,000 a ton, it's a political non-starter. It's just too expensive. And so these reports put the price at $500 to $1,000 a ton, which politically means you're dead. However, many scientists challenge that. And what the little line on the left of the chart is the opportunity. So there are already markets for carbon dioxide, food and industrial. One of those is soda, just the drink. You know, if you've gone to a large restaurant, you'll discover there's a tank of CO2 they use to carbonate the beverages. And for a variety of reasons, those companies would be delighted to use a environmentally friendly source of CO2. So you actually have a pretty good, it's a, 10 megatons, 10 million tons a year is used for the food and beverage industry. Anyway, and if you figure it out at a couple of $100s a ton, well, that's real money. It's hundreds of millions of dollars. So these are not jokes. The amount of money spent to date on things like direct air capture of actual plants is probably less than $100 million. It's in the same zone. So that's that at RPE we used to call those beachhead markets, a sort of World War II or World War I metaphor. And then you can start marching down to other processes. Now, the Solvay process should be a favorite of everybody around here because Solvay, New York, was named after Ernest Solvay, the co-inventor of the Solvay process. And it's not used in the United States anymore because we can mine sodium carbonate out west. There's a natural deposit. The United States is almost unique in having a very rich natural deposit. So the reason there's no Solvay process plant in Solvay, New York anymore is it's cheaper to mine it out west. But the rest of the world still uses them. And the Solvay process needs carbon dioxide. It's one of the elements. They get it by burning limestone. Seems kind of crude, but that's how they get carbon dioxide for the Solvay process. So there's another few hundred, millions of tons, tens of millions of tons per annum of a market, again, a beachhead market. And then by far the world's largest use of carbon dioxide at the moment is for extended oil recovery. They literally pump carbon dioxide into the ground to push oil out faster. And it sort of seems unclean. We're going to take clean carbon dioxide, suck straight out of the atmosphere, and use it to produce more oil. But I argue the main thing is to get these technologies to scale so we can find out what it should really cost at scale. And there's no clean hands in basically any technology area. Technology is agnostic. If you may not want people to use it the way you want them to use it, but they'll use it any way they can. So that's a huge market, and it has many advantages, what is it called? Anyway, sources of recoverable oil that are not near wellheads. There are carbon dioxide pipelines built in the United States to recover this oil. There are places where it's just not efficient to do that. If you could install one of these plants nearby, they would be happy to pump more oil out. So anyway, it's complex, but it's interesting. So now we go back. So there's the opportunity. If you can get it down below a few $100s a ton, you ought to be able to start learning. It's called following a learning curve. Start learning how to do it really cheaply. And there's no reason to think that you can't drop into the tens of dollars per ton if you have enough money to invest to learn how to do it. There is a thermodynamic limit. So at our current price of electricity, roughly 10 cents a kilowatt hour, it's actually a little less than that. If you price out what it takes to just separate carbon dioxide out of air, it's just fundamental thermodynamics, it comes out to be, I guess, about 25 cents or 30 cents a ton. Did I get this right? I think I might have actually put the wrong number on there. But in any case, it's, at 10 cents a kilowatt hour. Anyway, it's $20 or $30 per ton. Okay, so there's the opportunity. And just to let you know that it's not entirely hopeless, I visited this place. It's in Menlo Park, right next to Palo Alto. It's a company, pretty aggressive little company called Global Thermostat. There's a genuine, brilliant PhD chemist in the middle, his wife, who's actually an economist, and there's Mr. Bronfman, the rich Canadian liquor magnate, on the right, who's been funding a good deal of this. I've seen the machine itself. It's very simple. It takes advantage of automotive technology. They actually use pieces that would be used in catalytic converters. They have some nice chemistry. Anyway, and they claim, I have no idea if it's true, they claim $50 a ton. There's a lot of market for carbon dioxide at $50 a ton, and where their particular technology would end up if it was actually able to be used at a large scale, I don't know. There are many other companies that are playing with this space, most of them just essentially playing around in rather small non-industrial contexts. So anyway, there's reason for optimism, and to get back to my original point, it seems to me that direct air capture's costs are the beginning of a conversation of what it actually should be charged for emitting carbon. So I'll leave it at that unless there are immediate questions.
Ed, do you want to stand, or do you want to? Sure. So our next speaker is Ed Bogucz from the College of Computer Science and Engineering, and I'll put your slides up.
Great. Good morning. Happy to be here. Thanks, Shuba, for inviting me to participate. So this panel is on the technological responses to climate change, and I'm going to specifically talk about technological opportunities for energy efficiency and decarbonization. Since we're here in the ceremonial courtroom, I want to start by introducing a few exhibits just to motivate this. And actually, these are policy exhibits, and then we'll talk about them from a technological standpoint. So Exhibit A is last Friday, Governor Cuomo of New York State announced new energy efficient targets to cut greenhouse gas emissions and combat climate change. He actually announced his intention to do this in his State of the State address in January. He charged a bunch of people to figure out what the target should be, and he wanted to announce it by Earth Day. And then earlier last week, 100 different groups came together and said, you know, New York, you really got to do it. You're number 7 among states in energy efficiency. So they sharpened their pencils and came out with a plan. And so this is just to say that there is an appetite in New York State, and actually it's driven by politics, for being aggressive about energy efficiency. And then I'm going to talk about, you know, so can we do it? What's the technological response? Exhibit B, this is Alicia Barton. She's started in last June as the president and CEO of a state agency that's called NYSERDA, the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. She comes to NYSERDA from previous positions in Massachusetts. Massachusetts is actually more aggressive about doing things with energy efficiency than New York State. So actually in our corner of the world, we're excited that somebody from Massachusetts is coming from New York to lead this organization called NYSERDA. She gave a keynote speech at a conference in New York City last month, and in her slides, she actually started with a slide that said, New York is committed to deep decarbonization. And it's interesting, she shows, you know, on that plot, for years and years, the state has been talking about a greenhouse gas reduction target in 2030. Of reducing greenhouse gas emissions 40% below 1990 levels by 2030. The state, to think back of when this was, actually I believe it was when Eliot Spitzer was governor, has a target for 2050 of reducing greenhouse gas emissions 80% by 2050. Nobody's been talking about that. You know, it's like everybody's been focused on 2030. It's like if we get to 2030, then we'll think about 2050. So the interesting thing about Alicia Barton's talk, keynote talk a month ago, was the dot for 2050 is on that chart. So the conversation is now starting in the state about looking beyond 2030 and what do we have to do to get to 2050. And her subsequent slide had this chart. A 3-part strategy to combat emissions: energy efficiency, create low-carbon electricity, and I believe that this talk last month was the first time these words were ever seen from a New York State official in public, move away from fossil fuels. And actually, this is now a public strategy of the state's Energy Research and Development Authority, and it's driven by looking to 2050. You can get to 2030 without eliminating fossil fuels. You can't reduce greenhouse gas emissions 80% from 1990 levels without eliminating burning fossil fuels for heat in all buildings in New York State. So the fact that a state energy official is now saying the state needs to start thinking about moving away from fossil fuels, and you can see her hand on the wheel of directing NYSERDA to invest in research and development for new heating, ventilating, and air conditioning equipment that does not involve burning fossil fuels. It's fascinating. It's really, actually, it's an exciting time to be doing energy research and development in New York State. So now, Exhibit C in my presentation here is just to kind of introduce as evidence. So presumably everyone has seen this before. This is often called the Sankey diagram of the charts from, on the left, it's all the sources of energy, and then there are these 5 boxes: electricity generation, residential, commercial, industrial, transportation. Those are the uses. And then way over on the right, there's energy services. That's energy that's actually been kind of put to good use for those purposes. And then there's rejected energy. That's energy that's been lost. This is all measured in, this wonderful unit called quadrillion BTUs. I don't know what that's like for the economy. It's probably like measuring in like tenths of a cent or something. So a BTU is a wonderful unit of measure, a British thermal unit. It's the amount of heat that you have to apply to 1 pound of water to raise it 1 degree Fahrenheit. So in the United States, we use roughly 100 quads of energy from all these sources. It's used for these purposes. So those pink boxes, residential and commercial, those are buildings. And then Eric talked earlier about transportation. So there's the box for transportation. So transportation consumes in 2016, 27.9 quads of energy, and Eric said a tenth of that is for jet transportation. So I want to specifically now drill down into residential and commercial. These are buildings, so that's energy used for buildings, and you see that there's a lot of electricity that goes into buildings. So when you think about that rejected energy, a lot of the rejected energy is associated with electricity generation, and essentially that's attributable to buildings. So now Exhibit D, this is a white paper from an organization that's called the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy. This is a plan, here's kind of a roadmap to cut energy use and carbon emissions in half by 2040. And there's lots of different ways on here. The main thing about this is just to point out, it's like a couple of years ago, the fashionable thing to say, and I haven't heard it for a couple of years, was in energy efficiency, there's no silver bullet. There's no single thing that'll do it. We need silver buckshot. So we need lots of different innovations across a broad thing. So we need buildings and vehicles and appliances and intelligent buildings and homes and improvements in industrial efficiency. But if we have a strategy across all of those things, we can have a hope of reducing energy use and carbon emissions in half. So that's a vision. So now, so what am I up to? Exhibit E, this is slides from a part of the U.S. Department of Energy that's called the Building Technology Office. So this is like a headline. Again, energy use, that pie chart on the left, is another way of looking at the Sankey diagram and to say those green little pie slices, residential and commercial, that's the amount of energy that's used in buildings. And that includes the electrical use, and at the bottom you see it says building electrical use accounts for 75% of electricity is used for purposes in buildings. And then this is another slide from that presentation. And this begins to show the complexity of buildings, right? So residential, that's homes and also apartment buildings, but then the so-called commercial buildings, there's lots of different types. So this is a commercial building, like an academic use, but we can have food service, retail, hospitality, offices, healthcare, grocery, public, lots of different uses, lots of different things. And then those icons at the bottom say in buildings, there's lots of different uses. We have heating, ventilating, and air conditioning, and heating hot water, and clothes washing, and appliances, and windows are like a hole to the outside and letting the energy go, and light bulbs, and computers, and televisions, and everything else. So again, when we think about energy uses, it's easy to say buildings use energy, but it's all these various uses. So it's back to silver buckshot. So now, I just want to again kind of introduce into the record, there's this center that I lead called the Syracuse Center of Excellence. First thing I have to say, kind of enter into the record, we didn't name it that. There's a program in the state called Centers of Excellence. There are 11 Centers of Excellence across the state. Each is in a different technology area, so we're funded under that program. So we're the center that focuses on the built environment. And one of our areas of kind of greatest strength relates to how indoor environments affect people. So that's indoor environmental quality. And we couple that with building energy efficiency. We also have support work in clean and renewable energy and water resource management. We were established in 2002 under this program of statewide centers of excellence. And over the years, we've engaged more than 200 firms, institutions, and organizations to do collaborative projects. We have this funky building at the intersection of Interstates 81 and 690 down at the foot of the hill. And that building was designed to be an apparatus to do research, development, and demonstration of new technologies, particularly relating to buildings. So there's lots of little things here. We have the best in the world laboratory for testing people and their response to indoor environments, which has been used to do groundbreaking research on understanding the impact of air quality on people's decision-making in office environments. We've got a great space for kind of plugging and playing with new technologies in buildings, tested things like technologies for heating hot water. We have an office space that's a test bed. We have the side of our building, there's a big opening that we can plug things into. This is a concept for generating electricity and hot water as a part of a window. And then we have a tower on our site that we use to understand the local environment. And then other labs, we've got faculty members in the School of Architecture at Syracuse who are interested in new technologies for virtual reality and applying them to design. We're looking at new window technologies. There's a technology called electrochromatic glazing that tints windows on demand. And we have an office that has those windows installed. We have 3 laboratories that have faculty members in mechanical and aerospace engineering to do basic and applied research relating to fluid mechanics and heat transfer. SUNY ESF has a facility for biofuels. And we've recently installed photovoltaic glazing and chargers for electric vehicles. So again, this is kind of a test bed for all kinds of the silver buckshot of technologies relating to energy efficiency and decarbonization. Also, we've made investment in facilities on the 3rd floor of Link Hall. There's a one-of-a-kind facility that'll test the side of your house. So 10 feet high and 12 feet wide, and you slide it into the lab, and on one side you make it be outside conditions, and on the inside it's like a bedroom. You can understand the energy across the building exterior and also the impact of the exterior on indoor environmental quality. Professor Jensen Zhang in Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering designed and developed that facility, and he's used it for a variety of things, including using plants testing the idea of using plants as an air filtration technology. We also have on the south campus of Syracuse University, Professor Zhang and his collaborators built a house that is a test bed for building exteriors. There's 34 openings in that house, and we can plug a different building exterior and test them side by side. So this is a site that was developed with the U.S. Department of Energy. They specifically selected Syracuse University because we had faculty and students who knew how to do this, and our secret weapon for this facility, our weather. So we have 4-season weather in a day. So, and it's great for testing building exteriors. And we've done things like we understand the fluid mechanics in the vicinity of a person. So that's actually a simulated person. That's a heated mannequin. And we look at how people are breathing, where the breath is coming from, and we use that in informing the development of new technologies. So finally, I'm going to close with, we're not just in the lab. We really like to take things from the lab to the market and put things in the field. We've had a terrific, really exceptional experience in a community project that focuses on a neighborhood adjacent to downtown Syracuse. So, in this picture you see Onondaga Lake up there, and then over this is a strut of an airplane in the upper right of this image. Right next to that strut, you can see the green roof. That's the Armory. So there's Armory Square. So this neighborhood is called the Near West Side of the city of Syracuse. This is a great historic neighborhood that for 100 years in Syracuse, from like 1850 to 1950, was a vibrant neighborhood that had large employers, including Carrier Corporation at one time had a factory just over on the left edge. There's now a high school, Fowler High School. That was the location that Carrier had a factory. And then you see there's this big red building in there that's on West Fayette Street. That was a tremendous gear factory. And then all the workers lived in the neighborhood. So in this neighborhood, we've been involved since 2007. Right in the beginning, we had a source of funding. We offered residents the opportunity that we would pay for an energy audit on their house, because we wanted to know what houses in the neighborhood were like, and we did 35 houses with energy audits. And one of the houses we found, they really needed a new furnace, and we asked them, could we buy a new furnace for you? And that furnace would generate heat and also electricity, and we'd like to observe your use of that furnace. So, your part of the bargain would be we're going to monitor how that performs for you, and if the idea of generating electricity in your basement alongside heat is a good idea or not. We've helped homeowners with retrofits of their houses and their properties for stormwater management. We actually did a design of the neighborhood for to improve quality of the neighborhood and energy efficiency of the neighborhood. Everything in red there is either new construction or renovation in the neighborhood. And then we've participated in some significant projects to renovate existing buildings. This is a 100-year-old warehouse that was renovated to be really a state-of-the-art building for apartments and office space. That demonstrates how that building, if the building has, let me rephrase that, when the building has a zero carbon electricity source, that'll be a zero carbon building. There's no burning fossil fuels in that building. All the heat and all the hot water and everything else is produced with heat pumps which run on electricity. We've done design and construction of new homes in the neighborhood, or we participated in the design and construction of new homes in the neighborhood on vacant properties. This kind of shiny silver house on the left is designed using a technology that's called a passive house, which is especially low energy, and then the orange house and this house that just came on the screen are high performing low energy houses. So again, this back to comments about being interested in environmental justice. I mean, this is a neighborhood that in economics is, at least in 2007, was one of the most economically distressed census tracts in the country. And we have an understanding of what the housing stock and building stock looks like in that neighborhood, and what are the strategies that one can imagine using to convert it to a low carbon future. So those are the kinds of things that we've done in the field, and look forward to discussing them as part of the panel.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. It's exactly the kind of starting point I was looking for. So thanks to Eric, thanks to you, Ed. I have lots of questions about the technology, but I think we probably should move on to the policy, economics, law sphere a little bit, but hopefully we have a foundation where you can see how the different areas interact. So our next speaker is David Popp from the Maxwell School, who will speak on policy tools for green innovation in the energy sector. So about 15 minutes, but thank you.
Thank you. All right, so I'm going to talk about how we actually get there. So we talked a little bit about some of the technologies that might be available to promote clean energy and to reduce emissions. What are some of the ways that policies can support that, and how are different policies going to have different implications for what happens? Right? So in terms of thinking about developing technology, first we want to think about what is a technological process itself. And so when we think about technology, we can think of 3 different steps. So there's invention. So the way I think of invention is, you watch a cartoon and the character has a light bulb over its head. Right? That's when the idea is first born. Right? Innovation is then taking that idea and developing it into commercially viable products. What RPE is doing is kind of working on going from invention to innovation, right? Trying to take these ideas and make them commercially usable, right? So we can think of these kind of 2 are often grouped together as R&D, or research and development. And kind of rough, crude approximation is we can think of invention as the R, the research, and innovation as the D, the development, turning this into a viable product. We also want to think about diffusion, right? So once we have a product available, people have to use it. It's not going to have any impact unless it's actually getting out into the market, and so what actually influences people's choice of what they're going to use, and so that's under diffusion. Okay. The role of policy is important because at all 3 of the stages of development, there are market failures, what economists call market failures, that are going to interfere with the development of environmentally friendly technologies. So the first one, this gets back to the idea of a carbon tax, the idea of environmental externalities. Right, that pollution is created, it's a byproduct of production. There's typically not a market for pollution, right? And because of that, individuals are deciding what technologies they're going to use in their home, or businesses deciding what technologies they're going to use, aren't going to take the pollution into account in making their decisions. They don't have the incentives to reduce those emissions on their own, right? That's important for technology development because it gets, the invention and diffusion are linked. Firms aren't going to want to create new technologies unless they know there's going to be a market for it. Right? Now, I want to note this doesn't mean there's no market for clean technologies. Right? Certainly, there are people that have green preferences, and they're going to want clean technologies anyway. Think about energy efficiency. Right? There are some private benefits to energy efficiency. Your utility bills are going to be lower. The idea there is that it's not that demand is zero, but the demand is suboptimal. Right? For energy efficiency, you may take into account that my electricity bill is going to be lower, and take that benefit into account, decide you want to invest in a more efficient furnace. But you're not going to take into account the benefit that it means we're using less electricity and there's less fossil fuels being burned, and all that as well. Right? So environmental policy is designed to address these market failures. But it's not the only market failure when we think about technology. So the other problem is that knowledge is what economists call a public good. The idea here is that once a technology is publicly available, people can build on that knowledge. So Sir Isaac Newton talking about standing on the shoulders of giants when he did his research. And that's the idea here, right? Somebody invents something, somebody else builds on that, and we get better and better and better, right? That leads to what we call knowledge spillovers, right? So we get firms coming up with new inventions. So Apple develops the iPhone, we have this great new smartphone, and then Samsung comes out with their phone a year later, and other people come out with their phones, right? So they're building on the work that Apple did first, right? So that means that those knowledge has benefits to the community as a whole, benefits society, but Apple doesn't get the benefits of the sales that Samsung gets, right? And so that's an example of a spillover, right? So we have science and technology policy that addresses this. It can be very general, so we have intellectual property rights such as patents to protect people's ideas, or it could be very specific. So we have subsidies for renewable R&D that are designed to target specific types of innovation. Okay. So in thinking about developing clean technologies, we need policies that address both these market failures. Right? We want to have environmental policy to create demand for technologies. We want technology policy that's going to reduce the cost, that's going to provide some support for innovation, do the things that the markets are not going to do, even when the environmental policy is not in place. Right? The key point here is that technology policy can play a role, right? But it's not going to be a substitute for environmental policy. We can't simply say, well, let's just do research and work our way out of the problem, right? We're not going to have demand for those products unless we have the environmental policy as well, right? So R&D policy can help with development of technologies. We can have technology-specific diffusion policies, so investment tax credits for renewables, for example, to get things out to the market, right? But most of the research on this suggests that those policies play a supporting role, but we need to have broader policies that address the environmental market failures as well. Okay. So what do you want to do with the rest of the talk then? Think about kind of the role of policy. You're going to start with how policy affects the private sector. Think about what things the private sector will do, and then kind of looping back to the idea of those knowledge market failures, what things is the private sector not going to do, right? So what other policies are we going to need to be able to support that on top of what we're trying to do to encourage the private sector to innovate, okay? So in general, the idea is that clean technologies have higher costs, right? When we think about electricity, right, users care about the electricity service. You care that when I flip the switch, the lights go on. Like most people aren't worried about where does that electricity come from, right? This is different than we think about IT or life sciences, pharmaceuticals, where the innovation itself, innovation affects the product itself, right? And so we need to price that environmental impact into the good, right? So first thing is that when we have any type of environmental policy, whether it's a regulation, whether it's prices, right? Innovators will respond really quickly to that incentive, right? Because the price creates demand for these new products. So work that I did, work by Richard Newell and co-authors back, this is kind of the early work, the start of this work on induced innovation. Both of us find that when this is looking at the energy crisis in the 1970s, within 5 years after energy prices went up, we see most of the impact of R&D in response to higher energy prices, so people responding very quickly. Responses to environmental policy are even faster. So and the idea that one picture is worth 1,000 words. So this graph shows the share of patents in different countries that were and innovations related to climate-friendly innovations, so things trying to reduce emissions. So the Kyoto Protocol, is there a laser pointer? Yeah, okay. Yeah. So the Kyoto Protocol is 1998. Right? We have USA and Australia that didn't ratify the Kyoto Protocol, and all the other Annex I countries that did ratify the Kyoto Protocol. And you'll notice these lines are pretty much in step until the Kyoto Protocol comes along. The countries that ratified, big increase in climate-friendly emissions, no big increase in the US. Right? People responding to the incentives put in place by policy. Okay. But we want to think more broadly than this. There's lots of different ways that policy could affect. We could use a carbon tax, we could use tax credits, we could use command and control devices. So what policy instruments do we want to use? So broadly speaking, economists like to divide things, the idea of command and control and market-based policies. And economists will generally make an argument for the market-based policies for two reasons. One is that they lower the compliance costs, right? It encourages the people that have the cheapest ways of reducing emissions to do more. And they provide incentives for more innovation, right? The reason for that is that command and control policies give you incentive to meet the target, but there's no reward for going above and beyond the target, right? So once you've hit that target, innovation stops, right? Market-based policies, if you have a price for emissions, there's always a reward for improvement, right? Anytime you do better, you avoid having to pay the fee, you avoid having to pay the fine, right? And so if you can avoid that price, there's always incentives to do more, okay? But we also want to think about what types of technologies are going to be invented, right? So Ed had that little pie chart, looking at all the different ways, the silver buckshot, right? It's not as simple as having one technology. We're going to need a diverse range of technologies available. And so we can think about, will market-based policies give us this diverse range? Okay. So a way to think about this, I think, is useful. Instead of just thinking about the distinction between command and control or market-based, we can think of technology as either technology neutral or technology specific. So technology neutral policies are going to put a price on carbon, so carbon tax or cap and trade. Renewable portfolio standards, another example where we say we're going to have 20% of our energy from renewable sources, but it doesn't specify what technology you're going to use. Right? It lets the market decide what's the best way to reduce emissions. What's the best way to get renewables into New York State? Okay. Versus technology-specific policies. So technology-specific policies might be an investment tax credit that's targeted at solar energy, or feed-in tariffs. So feed-in tariffs have been used in some countries, in Germany, for example, as direct support for renewables, and they can be technology-specific. So in Germany, at the peak, the feed-in tariff for wind energy, so the feed-in tariff was basically a guaranteed price they were giving renewables on the grid. For wind, it was a price maybe about 15, 17 cents per kilowatt hour. At the highest, the feed-in tariff for solar was over 50 cents per kilowatt hour, right? So giving more support to solar because it was more expensive. Okay. So this distinction is important, right? So economists will often talk about letting the market pick winners, right? That one of the selling points of a carbon tax is that we just get the prices right. We put the price on carbon and let the market decide what's going to work, right? The point I want to make is the decision to let the market pick a winner is a policy decision that by itself is picking a winner, because we can basically know what's going to come out of it, right? If we say that we're going to let the market pick the winner, the market's going to focus on the technologies that are closest to market. So if you look at what happened, if you compare places where there was a renewable energy mandate versus the guaranteed prices like the feed-in tariffs, and we look at the innovation in those countries, right? Countries that just had the renewable energy mandate, all the innovation was in wind. Because wind is the technology, this is back, this research was looking at mostly the 1990s, early 2000s. Wind was the technology that was closest to market. Solar was more expensive. So the places where you see solar innovation are places like Germany where they had that subsidy in place, where they had that guaranteed price. This creates a policy dilemma, though. All right, so the dilemma here is that we said before, one of the reasons we use these market-based policies is they keep the cost down. We do the cheapest things first. So policies that promote specific technologies might do better for developing solar, developing something in the long run, but they're going to increase the short-run compliance costs. Right? So what do you want to do about that? So there's a couple kind of ideas in literature, and this kind of leads into the public policy, the public policy and the public sector role here. One is we can start with the broad-based policies, put the carbon tax in place to generally get the price right, and then think about limited subsidies for technologies that are furthest from the market. And those policies are going to be more effective if they can target other market failures. So we'll talk about the next part of the talk is think about what some of those other market failures might be, right? So this brings us to the technology market failure side of this, right? The idea that even if we have the carbon tax, because of these technology market failures, we're not necessarily going to get the right innovation anyway, right? We also can think about using government R&D to support long-term research needs. That the firms are working on the things that are closest to the market, the government can step in, so this is kind of the RPE model, and do the things that are further from the market, right? Okay. So what are some of the specific technology support policies that the government can use, right? So if we're thinking about the market failures that are in place, one is the idea of learning by doing, that the costs go down as we do more, right? So that justifies having direct subsidies for a specific technology to help us work down that learning curve, right? The evidence in this is that learning by doing does exist, but the returns tend to go away quickly, and so this, so the direct subsidies can be part of the solution, but they shouldn't be the main policy in place. There's capital market failures. There's barriers to commercialization. Again, some of the things RPE is trying to address, right? And so some recent research that I did suggests that research at government institutions, so this isn't just research funded by the government, but actually done at the government laboratories, does a better job than research at universities at moving alternative research from a basic to an applied stage. So it's looking at citations to journal articles by patents. The articles in the government laboratories are more highly cited than university research, right? The laboratories are doing work and kind of transitioning from basic research to getting things out to market. The government support can also overcome funding hurdles. So recent paper looks at the DOE's Small Business Innovation Research Grants. They look at companies that were just above and below the threshold for getting funding. The ones that got funding were twice as likely to receive subsequent venture capital. They produced more patents. They earned more revenue, right? So the funding was a big help getting over the fixed costs of starting up a new company. The last two relate specifically to R&D. So this idea of path dependency. So one of the roles that public R&D can play is building up the knowledge stock, that basic public good that other people can build upon, right? And so once you start down that road that people are building on, you get locked into a certain path. And so the government R&D can, so if we think that we have a path that's going down towards a fossil fuel-based economy, right, research to start on renewable energy can be a way to kind of move down a different path. So we can think of this what's called technology push, right? So as we focus on the demand side, but we can also think about the supply side of research, right? Creating the building blocks other researchers are going to use. And so this could be a role for public R&D investments. And then finally, there's some evidence. We think about the knowledge spillovers themselves. Do we want to invest more in clean energy? There is some evidence that the spillovers from clean energy are particularly high. And this is, this is partially because it's a newer technology, and so we're still kind of at the beginning of the learning curve, so to speak. But even compared to other other things like ICT and so on. So, this work suggests, they weren't just comparing dirty technology, they also compared it to other emerging technologies. The spillovers are relatively high in clean energy. And so again, there might be big social benefits to investing in that R&D. So I've got a couple of summary slides. So first talk about policy lessons. So the key points here, right, incentives matter, right? Having policies in place to create the demand for the products is important, but also that we want both broad-based and targeted policies, right? Broad-based to kind of set the market, then to think about, what things might the market not address, right? We can also use public R&D to complement what the private sector does, right? So we want to make sure that public R&D isn't necessarily duplicating things that private firms will do on their own. So some examples of that would be that more basic research, the building block idea, working on technologies that aren't close to market, because we saw before, right, the private sector is going to focus on the things that are closest to market, where they can cash in first. We can also think about that, there are applied areas where the benefits might be difficult to capture through market activity, right? So improved transmission for electricity or energy storage, for example, right? And then we're also asked to think about, research questions, ideas for interdisciplinary research. So what are some ideas for how we might interact? So one thing I'll point out, we think about the role of public R&D. That's definitely a place where there's a role for interdisciplinary research, right? So economists can talk about, get some guidelines on how money should be allocated, but we really need engineers to say what projects are most deserving from a technological standpoint, right? And so some of the things that economists can bring to the conversation, thinking about where are the remaining market failures. So again, we think about the technologies that are out there, which ones are firms going to do on their own, which ones need private support. There's emerging literature on behavioral economics that kind of touches on energy efficiency and how much people actually make use of these, so that's important. This paper that came out last year that simulates the different policies in the US. And I think this is actually an important point. So their work shows that the R&D market failures are more important than learning by doing. So we should be doing more to kind of subsidize the building block stage. But the actual policies that we currently have in place are much more in favor of deployment rather than research, right? So getting things out too quickly, getting things out when they're higher cost. Think about what types of funding are most effective. Do we want to be funding the private sector? Do we want the government labs doing the work on their own? And again, doing all this, kind of keeping in mind what will the private sector do, what will the public sector do, so we avoid duplicating and potentially crowding out private research. All right, thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you again. So it's a great transition, really gives a good overview. So the next speaker is Josh Sarnoff, I guess will be sitting and giving us his thoughts. Josh teaches at DePaul College of Law.
Thanks, Shuba. And I'm really happy to be here, and particularly to follow two optimists on technology and one optimist on the economics. So thankfully, David's already laid out for you the double public goods problem that we're facing, from the negative externalities of the environmental pollution and the positive externalities of funding innovation. The problem is even more complicated than that, because we have massive sunk costs in our the way that we structure our economy and the technology already there, temporal problems that if we pay for control now, the benefits are largely for future generations, and the international distribution of the benefits is highly unequal. So this is really in the nature of what some economists actually called wicked problems when you think about trying to address the politics of these issues. So just to temper the optimism with two serious concerns from a 2018 study from Yale and George Mason's communications on climate change programs, only 62% of people in this country are somewhat worried, and only 21% are very worried, and 45% feel helpless. Generating large-scale policy for regulatory control measures and technology funding in that climate is going to be quite difficult. And then from the 2018 European Academy's Science Advisory Council, one factor possibly contributing to a lack of urgency may be the belief that somehow technology will come to the rescue. The present report shows that such expectations may be seriously over-optimistic. So it's just a note of caution. We've had a long history of trying to address deep-seated issues in environmental policy, Clean Air Act being a particularly good example, where we have to adopt multiple strategies that end up having very high costs, that the public is often resistant to some of the more sensible measures in trying to generate the funding, particularly in the current political climate for federal intervention to regulate much more extensively and to fund much more extensively, which presumably requires, in most cases, higher taxes, is just quite difficult. So with that background, there are a number of areas where things are quite uncertain, and again, more research might be helpful. In particular, in regard to the form and effectiveness of government funding, again, relying principally on work done by the colleague to my immediate left, your right. This is what I said in the Emory Law Journal in about 5 years ago, that direct subsidies for particular innovation outputs will likely be more effective than indirect ones, such as general R&D tax subsidies, where there are market failures or other externalities that make commercialization of a technology unlikely. And recent studies suggest that subsidies may be less effective than market regulation, particularly regarding internalization of externalities and promoting innovation, that both combined are more effective than either separately, that subsidies may in some circumstances be more effective and efficient in inducing innovation than taxing externalities. That assumes that we have rational decision-making and we have the data on which to make these kinds of choices and the political will to impose them. In a different article that I published in the Vanderbilt Journal of Entertainment and Technology Law in 2016, I talk about all of the dysfunctions in our funding of science policy and innovation policy that really get in the way of rational decision-making. So I think we've got a whole lot of research and work to do on not just comparative effectiveness, but generating support for the comparative effectiveness analysis that would then lead to more sensible policy making before we're going to make a whole lot of progress. Nevertheless, things are still going on, and it's really nice to hear all of the great things that are going on that we can build off of. So where are we? We know that notwithstanding the development of many technologies following the UNFCCC in Kyoto, that had it not been for the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Russian economy, Kyoto was largely a failure in achieving mandatory targets. Paris depends on reaching voluntary national commitments. Already the compliance goals of 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees seem highly unlikely. There are serious moral hazard concerns that the more we focus on innovation technology solutions, it's going to reduce the regulatory costs to the countries that had historic contributions. And if we focus on market solutions, the flow of dollars in trade for these technologies is likely to run against the common but differentiated responsibilities to fund the solution to climate that the Paris Convention and the UNFCCC are presumably based on. We're already hitting gridlock on some of the choices between adaptive technologies, loosely categorized as negative emissions technologies, and solar climate engineering, and emission controls technologies. So it leads to all sorts of questions about, and again, thankfully following David, which technologies really are going to be more effective and at lower cost, and will avoid some of the public concerns about switching costs and other behavioral changes that we found through trying to regulate things like parking, through resistance to driving fees and other things are really difficult to impose as a political matter, at least in the United States and around the world. One area, again, that we think about when we think about these new technologies is switching of resource use patterns as well as switching of the actual technology. So if you think about HCFC and HFC substitution, that went relatively quickly when the technology had been developed and once there was sufficient political will. In contrast, doing things like switching, again, from fossil fuel and building use is a totally different question. How do we generate the political support? Where does the money come from? Those are quite difficult. How about concentrated animal feeding operations for methane, switching people's eating behaviors? These are really, really difficult questions. And we don't have very good research on how to manipulate, and I really mean the word manipulate, public opinion to try to line it up in better support behind these goals. So overall, in terms of innovation funding research needs, we need to make some kind of high-level decisions about where the money is going to go. Is it going to go principally toward better and more effective emissions regulation, better or more effective negative emissions technologies, or at least for hopefully some short-term protection benefits, to what degree we want to fund solar climate engineering. And again, even under each of those categories, there are so many different things that one can do. Again, for emissions regulation, the big ticket items, of course, are, power plants and carbon capture from power plants, as well as some transportation controls. For negative emissions technologies, we have all sorts of different options, from afforestation, land management, bioenergy and carbon capture, enhanced weathering, direct air capture, which you've heard a little bit about, ocean fertilization, and again, CCS. How do we make these decisions about which of these technologies is the government going to do some of the early stage R&D funding for? Should the government be involved in providing, guaranteed procurement, which then can be a pull mechanism for private money? All of these require comparative assessments of where the technology is going in the future and what the dollars are likely to be in terms of their eventual cost at scale, and we don't have very good information about that. So we're going to be kind of blindly going into what are likely to be some bruising political battles unless we can generate a lot more good early stage and analytic work around some of these issues. Same thing for marine cloud brightening versus sulfate aerosol technologies of various sorts, if we're dealing with solar climbing and engineering. So I'm not going to go over, again, I think David did a terrific job talking about the kinds of different funding choices. Do we want direct research fundings, R&D tax subsidies? When we do these things, do we want to do subsidies versus prizes versus patents, or all of them at the same time? But I do want to focus on, if this is a massive amount of government funding, what kinds of ownership controls over the funding should the government continue to exercise? Because that's a big issue about how the technology gets used in the market and how it gets deployed. Many of you may be aware of the Bayh-Dole Act, which gives the government basically a free license to use technology that it funds anywhere in the world for any government purpose. It also has the ability to march in and make sure that the rights are being used in a manner that makes the technology reasonably available. The government usually hasn't in the past marched in to regulate prices when the prices are high, but if these are going to be very costly solutions to a very important problem, we really ought to be thinking much more carefully about how the government controls the technology that it funds, including assuring widespread access so that you don't have trade secrecy in the data that's generated from many of these projects, as well as that if patent rights are sought, that those patent rights are used to prevent competitive research, even in the absence of an experimental use exception. The last thing I'll just say is that similarly, we need a lot more research, I think, on the development and dissemination portion of how we do this funding for technology development. Do we really want to focus, since this really is a large public good problem, government procurement, or using the government to test markets that then induce private money to come in, or creating pull mechanisms that do the same thing? How do we get to the scale economies to development? And here again, the costs of the government versus the private sector are critical, and that just brings me to my final thought, which is the ideology. There's been a traditional, if highly divisive, debate over whether government picks winners or the market should pick winners. Yet the government is promoting technologies all the time and picking winners in the ways that have been discussed all the time. The question is, can we do it better? And unfortunately, much of the time we lack the data to do those kinds of analyses. So probably the most valuable thing we could do is create a new law that requires the disclosure of licensing information in a meaningful way and actually have a better sense of where the government money is going and how it's developing technologies and where the roadblocks come from. With that, I'll stop.
I guess we're going to put all the burden on Zach now. No, it's a great.
Yeah, you're going to solve it, exactly. Right?
Great presentations. I mean, I want to thank again, Eric and Ed for laying out the technological possibilities, and then for David for the nuanced policy issues in great detail, and then Josh, the lawyerly job of sort of demolishing a lot of these things in some ways. So Zachary has a great paper out on innovation snowballing, and we'll talk about that and some other ideas. Zachary is kindly joining us, visiting us from Yale Law School. So thank you. I think that's the pointer. Yeah, absolutely.
Great. So thanks so much for the invitation to speak today. I'm an economist and a lawyer, so hopefully I can link the first session, which has been a lot on economics and technology, with the second session, which is a lot on policy. So I want to, we're going to be speaking about innovation snowballing, climate policy, and a state climate innovation coalition. And I want to begin by going back to foundations and ask why we should not just have a carbon tax and call it a day. Why a carbon tax is not sufficient. So I'm going to be, in many ways, kind of jumping off and kind of delving into some things that David Popp was talking about. So we all know there are spillovers when people develop technologies. Innovators can't capture the full benefits of the innovations that they develop. So that's a reason to encourage innovation. There's a problem with that, though, with respect to clean energy, which is that the same is true of dirty technology as well. There are spillovers when solar energy is developed, but there also are spillovers probably when offshore drilling is developed. So when we're talking about technology with respect to climate, we need some good theories, ideally some evidence as well, some of which David alluded to, for why we want to target innovation specifically in the context of clean energy. And I'm going to suggest that what David called path dependence, what I'm going to call innovation snowballing, is an important and I think probably dominant rationale for why we should do this. And this results from the way innovation happens, that innovation happens by standing on the shoulders of giants. So I want to leave you with 3 points at the end, so I'm going to leave them with you, tell them to you now. Point 1, that innovation snowballing is an important reason to invest in a big push of government funds in clean tech innovation, and that we should do that now. Second, that there are specific policy implications coming from a foundation in innovation snowballing, if that really is the reason that we think we should be spending a lot on clean tech innovation specifically. And third, I'm going to leave you at the end with a specific policy proposal, a state climate innovation coalition, paralleling what we see today on emissions reductions and RGGI and regarding the Paris Agreement. So let me begin with a stylized example, of course, of what I mean by innovation snowballing. So this is this is using research done by David Popp and others, David Driesen. David Popp in particular has done important theoretical and empirical work in this area. But let me develop it here for you in this little diagram. So suppose that technology, so we think technology develops in technology trees. So each of these blocks represents a piece of technology. So right now we've had a century of government support for dirty technology. We've had subsidies, we've had a lack of a carbon tax. So we have a bunch of blocks of dirty technology right now. And those are the ones with the ominous dashed black lines. We have much less clean tech. Those are the green diagonal lines, because there hasn't been much support for a long period of time. As a result, you can see on the y-axis, I think dirty technology tends to be, not always, but tends to be cheaper to produce. Got a lot of innovation across a long period of time, how to extract fossil fuels from the ground and burn them cheaply. So that's the state of play. What does this mean for future innovations likely to happen from a private innovator? So what's going to tend to happen is that private innovators are going to tend to, not always, but they're going to gravitate toward the dirty technology tree. Why? Because it tends to be the case that fossil fuel technologies are the cutting edge technology. You can, if you innovate, you can bring that innovation to market pretty quickly and make a quick return on your investment. So that is the state of play today. Instead, what would happen if there were a big government clean tech investment, if there were a big push in clean tech energy, the state of play would be very different. The cutting edge technology would instead be the green technology, the clean technology. So that a private innovator would tend to, again, not always, but would tend to gravitate toward the clean energy technology. So you have that big government investments, but then that has important knock-on effects that then mobilizes the private sector and draws in more innovation for clean tech. So this is for one private innovator. What might this look like over time? So if we have no clean tech push, what we might see is clean tech developing more slowly, dirty tech developing more quickly, more investment in offshore drilling, in fracking, in the internal combustion engine, in liquefied natural gas, with private innovators drawn to the cutting edge technology, which is dirty tech. If instead there is a big clean tech, big government push in clean tech investments, below where it says that, with the color not showing up, it would not only be the case that there'd be an uptick in clean tech innovation, but dirty tech innovation would slow down, because private innovators would reallocate their efforts toward clean tech, since it's better to be innovating in an area where you can take your innovation to market more quickly. Of course, we're getting some clean tech innovation now, and in some ways, the cheaper technology. Sometimes it's solar, but experts, such as they can guess, think that we need twice as much public investment now in clean tech as we're currently getting. And part of that's because, keep in mind, the thing that we need to avoid climate catastrophe in the future is not that a new installation of solar is cheaper than a new installation of natural gas. It's that the new installation of solar or wind needs to be cheaper than the already existing installations of fossil fuel technologies. So we've still got a long way to go, and we need a lot more money to do that. But in particular, I next want to cash out. So if we think this is the mechanism that drives why we want to have a lot of particular investment in clean energy technology, why the Center for Excellence is particularly excellent, let me describe a few of those implications. Implication one is where in the technology line of technological development we would want to intervene. So conventional wisdom is you want to intervene as early as possible in the development of technologies for basic R&D. We think the spillovers there are largest. That's all totally sensible. But if you think that innovation snowballing is an important driver of why we should be investing in clean energy technology specifically, that places a thumb on the scale of, not totally, but more value, relatively more value of innovation, of support for late-stage clean energy innovations. Why is that? The thing with basic R&D is you don't know where it's going to go. Basic R&D might end up building up the clean energy technology tree, but it also might end up developing the dirty energy technology tree. So take an example of something like biofuels. Biofuels seem like clean energy, right? That's true, but it turns out that a lot of those technologies end up benefiting the dirty energy technology tree. Why is that? It's because when you're using biofuels, you're burning stuff. You're doubling down on the internal combustion engine, which in many ways is exactly what we want to be getting away from. So that places a thumb on the scale of technologies that we really think will help us out with wind, solar, batteries, et cetera, things that we really think are not going to be helping to kind of build up dirty tech. Second point, when should we do this? If we think that innovation snowballing is an important driver, we need to do this now. We need to spend billions of dollars more a year now. The reason we need to do that is that the longer we wait to do so, the more dirty technology there will be around, and the deeper the rut we'll have to overcome in order to achieve the clean energy future that we want. And it's important to note here that a bigger carbon tax won't do it, or at least won't do it efficiently. Carbon tax is great, super important, we should definitely do it. The state and local initiatives are super important, probably some of the most important things going on in climate today in the country, but they're not the best way of achieving technological gains, because when you have a carbon tax, a couple things happen. One, people innovate, which is great, but people also reduce their consumption. And that's good as well. We want to reduce carbon emissions, but to the extent that we really, really want to focus on shifting to the clean energy technology tree, the focus today ought to be on, or in many ways, ought to be on technology, which means supporting clean energy technology specifically. Third point, on how we would want to do this. So there are a few implications for the various tools that we use to support technology. So first is that it might make sense to loosen intellectual property in the context of clean energy and instead use more direct government support. That could in principle be through the buy-dual mechanism if we accompany it with more government support. Why is that? If we want to promote the standing on the shoulders of giants mechanism, that'll be easier if the various parties don't have to buy the IP from other parties, which is costly and time-consuming and can lead to litigation. There also are a variety of non-innovation tools that we use to support clean energy technology, and innovation snowballing has some implications for the value of those. So there's been a lot of campaigning over the last few years over over infrastructure projects like Keystone XL, because we don't want to be continuing to use more fossil fuels. Innovation snowballing suggests that there's an additional reason why that might be a decent strategy. So if we built that long pipeline, there's probably going to be some more innovation in figuring out how to build really good pipelines. And stopping that would not only, stopping things like those stopping those big infrastructure projects means not only that you don't have the lock-in of having the infrastructure on the ground, it also means you don't have the additional innovation induced by building these large technology projects, or large infrastructure projects. Second point, we've been using CAFE standards for a few decades now to induce cleaner cars. Innovation snowballing kind of raises some red flags about the use of CAFE standards and maybe similar performance standards. So, what's happened as we have raised CAFE standards? Well, we've developed better and better and better combustion engines. And we've spent thrown more and more and more resources into this technology that is in many ways doubling down on the dirty tech technology tree. Of course, it's also helped induce electric cars and hybrid, et cetera, but a lot of it's been the internal combustion engine. And to the extent we want to totally reorient our technology toward clean energy, toward batteries, toward electrics, it is less clear how valuable CAFE has been. All right, so finally, I want to leave us with a specific proposal. So experts think that we need another $6 billion a year from the US. This is an amount that Obama committed to in mission innovation, which is an agreement adjacent to the Paris Agreement that has even less force than the Paris Agreement. The feds are obviously not going to do much. It's great that we have a 15% increase in RPE, but we're not going to get anywhere close to a $6 billion a year increase with this administration and this Congress. Instead, I think what we need is a coalition of states that commit to pour money into innovation and clean tech. So we already have states acting on carbon trading. We already have cap and trade. And that's really, really great. And we should continue doing that, but it's not enough. And of course, we have lots of state initiatives like the Center for Excellence, but also not enough. It's enough in type, but not enough in magnitude. So we need a parallel coalition to the group of states that have been restricting their emissions to this group of states that will invest in innovation specifically. And let me leave you with a point about political economy. So what happens when New York and Connecticut and California restrict their emissions? Emissions will probably go down, and emissions will go down in those states. And that's really terrific. And we should support that. But there's a big difference between that and what happens when the Center for Excellence innovates new things, which is that'll help out that'll reduce emissions not only in New York, it'll reduce emissions around the world, because those innovations can travel everywhere. And when states have things like RGGI to reduce emissions, they can reduce their own emissions, but they can't reduce stuff around the world. They cannot reduce emissions around the country and around the world. And furthermore, they can't even commit future legislatures in their own states to continue reducing emissions. In contrast, with innovation, with technology that actually reduces clean tech to be the cheaper technology than dirty tech, New York and California can actually make sure that Georgia and Texas and Mississippi adopt clean energy technologies, and can furthermore ensure that future legislatures and countries around the world adopt those technologies. Because it's much harder to, you can repeal a carbon tax, it's much harder to repeal technological progress. So thanks a lot, and I look forward to your comments.
10 to 15-minute question or reaction from the panelists have anything to say. I think we started off with carbon taxes and then we ended with a little bit of retreat. But the thoughts or comments from panelists? Or
it's a question for almost everybody, but particularly taking off of Zach's. Given the really high switching costs, one of the problems with snowballing is it may exacerbate technology lock-in on early technologies that aren't ultimately as potentially useful and carbon reducing as other technologies that might be developed. Is there a way to avoid technology lock-in that any of you have seen that makes sense?
Well, let me just, I've worked in solar cells for decades, so I'll just say that a little bit of innovation snowballing has occurred accidentally from over-subsidization, not by us, but by the Chinese. So as of today, in many contracts for prepaid purchase agreements, photovoltaics are actually beating natural gas. But that would have been inconceivable with of order hundreds of billions of investment by the Chinese in what amounts to late stage. It was not fundamental research, but they learned through their investment how to drive the price down to what seemed like insane levels. So insane the United States has decided to put a tariff on it to protect local industry. It will not likely be effective. But in any case, but I think it's an interesting example of what I'll call innovation snowballing actually working, only no one ever designed it for that purpose. I mean, the politics of it was crazy, but it did happen.
I have not an empirical thought, but a policy thought, which is that to the extent that policies like Obama's climate regs lead to, which are great and we should support them, but something that gives me a little pause is to the extent that they lead to the building of a bunch of new gas-fired power plants. You know, we shut down really old coal power plants and we build new natural gas power plants. That's nice in the short run. In the long term, is that the right thing to do? I'm not so sure. I think it could easily be valuable to keep around the old suckers, which are very polluting, for a few more years, and instead just go directly to things that are carbon neutral, precisely because of technology lock-in, which gives me a lot of concern. And so I guess I totally agree, and I think that a focus on really, really pushing on the innovation front today will help achieve that, rather than the emissions reduction front today. Though we should still be pushing a lot on that as well.
The one thing I would add to that, I think, is we can think of, kind of go off your day, we can think of the height of the tree. Your kind of argument that the fossil fuel tree is high, and so everybody's grabbing from there. We also think of the quality of the tree. And so the one thing we do observe empirically is that you do see diminishing returns to research over time, and this is so the works that was talking about the spillovers being larger for clean energy is partially because a lot of the low-hanging fruit have already been taken off the fossil fuel tree and not from the clean energy tree, and so that can be a counteracting force to the lock-in, is that there's just at some point there's not that much further we can go, but then again it comes back to the policy to get somebody to want to start looking at where that where the low-hanging fruit are. Right?
I'm just going to make the quick observation for Zach with that number on the screen. So the Obama administration commitment to $6.4 billion. So the coalition of states idea. So New York State, through this state agency, NYSERDA, is investing $500 million a year in various things that could be packaged as clean energy. And actually, I'd say that's like a material number compared to that number. And that if you had a couple of states that were able to do something like that, you'd be making a dent in that number. And it's about scale and impact, right? So New York State is looking to stimulate innovation in technologies that are going to help the state reach its goals. So it doesn't have to actually tackle the country's problems. And now when you think about the state, you can think about the state's climate and the state's building stock and the state's transportation and so on. So solving things at a state level, I actually think the numbers kind of line up. So $500 million a year over 10 years, you could think of hitting these targets in a way. So it's beginning to play out. So
actually, that's in addition to what we already do now.
Right.
But
okay.
That's very hopeful. You made me more optimistic.
Well, so I also want to acknowledge that I am an optimist. So and I accept. So the great thing about or the wicked problem of stranded costs. I mean, the gigantic stranded cost is the electric distribution grid. Oh, yeah. I mean, that's 100-year-old technology lock-in. Right. The joke is, Thomas Edison and Alexander Graham Bell come back from the dead and they look at, electricity and telecommunications, and Alexander Graham Bell's like, wow, man, satellites, cell phones. And Thomas Edison says, oh, I know, I'll fix this. I know how to do it. It's like the same as when I left. So these ancient commitments that were made to utilities about having franchises in territories are, the technology is the easy part. The policy of like unpacking those agreements that were made 100 years ago, I have no idea how you take that on.
Not easily. I mean, the one that gets me is, you think about the choice to use cars for commuting versus electric rail, right. And the big issue is right-of-way. How are you going to unpack the right-of-way? China can do it because they just move people and don't pay them. It's a very different system, right? These are really deep political problems with big money dollars attached, and that's why, again, some of the concern is that the money that we would spend is going to reinforce existing patterns rather than change them. To the extent, and that's where, again, the externality pricing can actually help to address a little bit the inefficiencies of the existing systems that have developed over time, but it isn't going to be enough, and certainly not enough at the levels of political will that we've shown so far.
Oh, I was just going to challenge the 6.4 billion number, which is, in my opinion, nowhere near what would actually have to be done. I'll throw China back in. They spent more than that on just one technology, photovoltaics.
So this comes from some international association of scientists. So this is the U.S. share. The U.S. share would be $12 billion annually. That would include $12 billion. That would be good. I have no expertise on this.
Oh, that would be great, but
yeah. So you think $12 billion a year for the U.S. So I think it was $70 billion total for the world. Do you think that that's
no? Something of order $100 billion a year is my guess. If you want to get innovation snowballing, okay. I mean, you could have predicted a long time ago that photovoltaics would ultimately be able to supplant natural gas, and you would have calculated the cost of investment, and it would have been in the hundreds of billions of dollars. We finally spent it, and it happened, but it's just an analysis of experience curve. And the Chinese had no intention to do that. Politics was totally different. It was not an intentional investment, but it's a good example of what it actually takes to drive it. Wind seems to be at the tipping point also, just with recent innovations, which I don't think was government driven, but there was enough money to be made all along that they've made amazing progress with these enormous facilities, and even offshore, which I thought was a non-starter, is coming alive again. So these are very optimistic, really. Sounding like Ed, which I don't usually, but in any case, I mean, 100 billion worldwide would be huge if it was directed intelligently. But I don't know if we can do that. But the United States, you'd think, would have a bigger share than 6. But.
Yeah. Just a quick question. We're in California and New York are doing these very specific kinds of R&D projects. What confidence do you actually have that they will share the results? So not to mention Poland. The history in this context of state-funded research at universities that generate agricultural technologies, medical technologies, and the sharing that emerges from that is less than stellar.
Well, what's your experience with the Center for Excellence on sharing?
There's a strong market pull. So if there's market pull for an innovation in another place, and there'd be a lot of interest for seeing a state investment stimulate an innovation that's commercialized by a company in New York State. And if that company can sell that technology someplace else and tie it back to employing people in New York State, that's a gigantic win for the state.
By that, I think the argument that Zachary is making is a little bit more on the sort of public good stuff
I mean, oh, that's not the argument at all. The argument is precisely what's happening with China. So China is spending a bunch of money in solar, and then the solar cells are being installed in the U.S. Denmark invested money, or in any case, Danes innovated in wind, and now those wind turbines are installed in the U.S. So there doesn't need to be sharing at all. In fact, there needs to be no sharing at all. It's just, in fact, the market pull is actually the right way to put it. If in central New York the cheap way to produce energy is developed and it's commercialized and it's still the cheapest way, they can sell it to Texas, and Texas will buy it the utilities in Texas will buy it because it's the cheapest way to do it. So altruism need not at all be, or even any kind of market failure, need not be at all a motive here. Though it certainly would be helped to the extent there's more sharing.
It sounds like you're talking about a clean tech writer to go back to having a war zone. Right? This is a full contract rather than the push of the government necessarily. And I think Keith's point about sharing though is another aspect. Again, not fully understanding, but in other words, the trade secrecy aspects of an IP firm. The proper incentive to create these collaborative research and development efforts across it. And maybe another dimension would be better. Well, the bigger the area within the solution happens, the better. We'll be those ones as well.
So two things just to follow. The first is it assumes reasonable cost pricing by the developer, which is a real issue. And again, those are things, if there's federal money, could be potentially controlled. It depends on the IP structure and how the government wants to regulate this stuff. Again, compulsory licensing is another possible. The more important issue, though, goes back to this common but differentiated responsibilities question. Is there an obligation to share under this, the UN Convention and the Paris Agreement, some of this technology for use in other countries, which then would drive below market pricing in a way that then helps with the problem overall? That's a much more difficult question, but it's part of the question, because to the extent that that's going to occur, and if there's no subsidy for the differential, that may diminish the market and therefore diminish the ex-ante incentives to develop the technology in the first place.
One more, just question here. You want to answer? Oh, that wasn't the question.
So I heard some question. So a lot of this is people talk about direct government funding, right? And so one of the things about direct government funding is this concern about the fact that if you think about direct government funding as an alternative to a substitute for private funding, or at least as a collaborative, right? One of the questions that arises is, if the direct government funding results then in corporatization into the private sector, isn't that a fundamental inefficiency? Isn't that essentially sort of, it's not just subsidies, but it sort of is a double cost. You don't just get the direct money, you take also the cost of market recovery and ship it over to the private sector, and you get a windfall on top of that. And so my concern about direct government funding is that it doesn't have a strong sort of mechanism for what the public good benefit from the government funds would be, and directing that in a specific way, either by a price mechanism, either by a partnership collaboration mechanism, that doesn't encourage spillover. It doesn't have a deliberate, directed sort of spillover regime associated with it. Is that direct government funding is fundamentally inefficient in that context? So, both for Edmund.
Yeah, I totally agree. In the context of clean tech, I think there's a pretty strong case to weakening IP protections for clean tech that has received some sort of government funding. I mean, there's a trade-off. Like, you get the monopoly on the IP that encourages people to develop the IP. On the other hand, it makes it harder for others to use the IP that was developed by the original innovator. And I'm not an IP scholar. My sense of I have one to my left. My sense is of IP scholars' view of the literature is that we do not have things optimized correctly now. That there's too much propertization of IP, and that direct government support through prizes. Prizes are a popular thing now. You have a prize, and then you have free IP that can be shared, and you get rid of the monopoly problem that you're describing. So that's my sense. And it seems like in the area of clean tech, it seems like a particularly strong case, but others, I'm sure, have more expert thoughts.
Please tell me about the view of your work.
It's been very supportive, so it's the simplest answer is it depends on the source of funds, right? So if it's federal funds or state funds or a company pays, or so who paid and what are the terms? In your question, one of the things, I'm a optimist because I'm interested in the silver buckshot, right? So I can say, well, I have this shiny object. I was like, here's this thing that we can do that makes this difference in this little corner. So I'll give one specific example. There's a solicitation that's out right now from this state agency. It actually there's a due date of Thursday, which is tomorrow, for ideas in a variety of areas. But there's one very specific thing. Again, it's like a state-specific thing. So in the New York City market, there's a lot of apartment buildings. And a lot of apartments have air conditioning and heating systems that are called packaged terminal air conditioners. So these are boxes that provide air conditioning. They go on an outside wall, and they're able to interact with outdoors, and then on the inside side, it's like what you have in a hotel room. So in New York City, there are hundreds of thousands of these that were typically made in the 70s. And it's very, very energy inefficient. So the state actually has done this inventory and said, well, we can quantify if we replaced all of those with modern equipment, we can quantify energy savings and energy efficiency. So there's a solicitation out. It's very, very specific. We want a box that can go into this size hole to fit in this market. Now, I don't think there's enough market demand to drive that innovation, right? So here's a role for a state to say there's a public benefit to replacing all those old equipment, and then the state's going to invest to incentivize the development of an innovation that once it's developed, that's going to go into that market. But it's a really niche market for a niche application. So I don't know if that's that's a silver buckshot. That's a specific thing to solve a specific problem, and it's totally technologically that's easy. So
Just add, Jabo, that government or funding doesn't always mean private R&D, because there are things like NREL and other places, and we don't know the relative competences of which one works best in what context always.
Yeah, two things that I would say. One is that, to the extent that it does involve public-private partnerships, the key thing to remember is that a partnership involves two willing partners, right? And so the more you double down on the wanting to increase the spillovers and increase the disclosure, the less willing you're going to have private sector companies willing to participate. But the other question, and I'm going to ask this today, people here too, is I haven't heard a lot of stories of IP really being a big barrier to development in terms of clean energy. And I think this partially go back to the silver buckshot thing, that because it is such a diverse range of technologies, this isn't like pharmaceuticals where if you have the patent and you have the drug, it's either that or nothing else. I think it's easier to invent around in a case where there's lots of different technologies out there, and the easier it is to invent around, the less the IP is going to serve as a barrier. Yeah, not good. Dear.
Okay.